Chapter 17 of King Richard I. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. King Richard I by Jacob Abbott, Chapter 17. The Old Man of the Mountains. One of the greatest sources of trouble and difficulty which Richard experienced in managing his heterogeneous mass of followers was the quarrel which has already been alluded to between the two knights who claimed the right to be the king of Jerusalem whenever possession of that city should by any means be obtained. The reader will recollect perhaps that it has already been stated that a very renowned crusader named Geoffrey of Bouillon had penetrated about 100 years before this time into the interior of the Holy Land at the head of a large army, and there had taken possession of Jerusalem. That the earls and barons and other prominent knights in his army had chosen him king of the city, and fixed the crown and the royal title upon him and his descendants forever. That Jerusalem was itself after a time lost, the title still remained in Godfrey's family, and that it descended to a princess named Sibylla. That a knight named Guy of Lusignan married Sibylla, and then claimed the title of King of Jerusalem in the right of his wife. That, in process of time, Sibylla died, and then one party claimed that the rights of her husband, Guy of Lusignan, ceased, since he held them only through his wife, and that thenceforward the title and the crown vested in Isabella, her sister, who was the next heir. That Isabella, however, was married to a man who was too feeble and timid to assert his claims. That consequently a more bold and unscrupulous knight, named Conrad of Montferrat, seized her and carried her off, and afterward procured a divorce for her from her former husband, and married her himself. And that then a great quarrel arose between Guy of Lusignan and the husband of Sibylla, and Conrad of Montferrat, the husband of Isabella. This quarrel had now been raging a long time, and all attempts to settle it or to compromise it had proved wholly unavailing. The ground which Guy and his friends and adherents took was that while they admitted that Guy held the title of King of Jerusalem in the right of his wife, and that his wife was now dead, still being once invested with the crown, it was his for life, and he could not justly be deprived of it. After his death it might descend very properly to the next heir, but during his lifetime it vested in him. Conrad, on the other hand, and the friends and adherents who espoused his case, argued that since Guy had no claim whatever, except what came in and through his wife, of course when his wife died, his possession ought to terminate. If Sibylla had had children, the crown would have descended to one of them, but she being without direct heirs, it passed of right to Isabella, his sister, and that Isabella's husband was entitled to claim and take possession of it in her name. It is obvious that this was a very nice and delicate question, and it would have been a very difficult one for a company of gay and reckless soldiers like the Crusaders to settle if they had attempted to look at it simply as a question of law and right. But the Crusaders seldom troubled themselves with examining legal arguments, and still less with seeking for and applying principles of justice and right in taking sides in the contests that arose among them. The question for each man to consider in such cases was simply, which side is it most for my interests and those of my party that we should espouse? We will take that. Or, which side are my rivals and enemies, or those of their party going to take? We will take the other. It was such considerations as these that the different princes and nobles and orders of knights in the army decided how they would range themselves on this great question. As has already been explained, Richard took up the cause of Guy, who claimed through the deceased Sibylla. He had been induced to do so not by any convictions which he had formed in respect to the merits of the case, but because Guy had come to him while he was in Cyprus, and had made such proposals there in respect to a conjunction with him, that Richard deemed it for his interest to accept them. In a similar way, Conrad had waited upon Philip as soon as he arrived before Acre, and had induced him to espouse his, Conrad's, side. If there were two orders of knights in the army, or two bodies of soldiery, that were at ill will with each other through rivalry or jealousy or former quarrels, they would always separate on this question of the King of Jerusalem, and just as certainly as one of them showed a disposition to take the side of Guy, the other would immediately go over to that of Conrad, and then these old and half-smothered contentions would break out anew. Thus this difficulty was not only a serious quarrel in itself, but it was a means of reviving and giving new force and intensity to a vast number of other quarrels. It may seem strange that a question like this, which related as it would appear to only an empty title, should have been deemed so important, but in reality there was something more than the mere title at issue. Although for the time being the Christians were excluded from Jerusalem, they were all continually hoping to be very soon restored to the possession of it, and then the king of the city would become a very important personage, not only in his own estimation and in that of the army of the Crusaders, but in that of all Christendom. No one knew but that in a few months Jerusalem might come into their hands, either by being retaken through force of arms, or by ceded in some way through Richard's negotiations with Saladin, and, of course, the greater the probability was that this event would happen, the more important the issue of the quarrel became, and the more angry with each other and excited were the parties to it. Thus Richard found that all his plans for getting possession of Jerusalem were grievously impeded by these dissensions. For the nearer he came at any time to the realization of his hopes, the more completely were his efforts to secure the end paralysed by the increased violence and bitterness of the quarrel that reigned amongst his followers. The principal supporters of the cause of Conrad were the French, and they formed so numerous and powerful a portion of the army, and they had withal so great an influence over other bodies of troops from different parts of Europe, that Richard could not successfully resist them and maintain Guy's claims, and he finally concluded to give up, or to pretend to give up, the contest. So he made an arrangement with Guy to relinquish his claims on the condition of his receiving the King of Cyprus instead. The unhappy Isaac, the true king of that island, shut up in the Syrian dungeon to which Richard had consigned him, being on no condition to resist this disposition of his dominions. Richard then agreed that Conrad should be acknowledged as King of Jerusalem, and to seal and settle the question, it was determined that he should be crowned forthwith. It was supposed at the time that one reason which induced Richard to give up Guy and adopt Conrad as the future sovereign of the Holy City was that Conrad was a far more able warrior and a far more influential and powerful man than Guy, and altogether a more suitable person to be left in command of the army in case of Richard's return to England, provided, in the meantime, Jerusalem should be taken, and, moreover, he was much more likely to succeed as a leader of the troops in a march against the city, in case Richard were to leave before the conquest should be effected. It turned out, however, in the end, as will be seen in the sequel, that the views with which Richard adopted this plan were of a very different character. Conrad was already the King of Tyre. The position which he thus held was, in fact, one of the elements of his power and influence amongst the Crusaders. It was determined that his coronation as King of Jerusalem should take place at Tyre, and accordingly, as soon as the arrangement of the question had been fully and finally agreed upon, all parties proceeded to Tyre, and there commenced at once the preparations for a magnificent coronation. All the principal chieftains and dignitaries of the army that could be spared from the other posts along the coast went to Tyre to be present